Everybody, here we go. So this is the second progressive lecture, skipping from muckraking to the government actually taking action. First and second, we talked about this in class. Sixth, this is going to be all new. So the late 1800s, as you know, produced a lot of problems. We spent a day talking about those. In the 1890s, the muckrakers began drawing attention to the problems with their photography and their writing. And eventually, slowly, the government began responding. One of the distinctions I want you to be able to make is the difference between state reforms and federal reforms. A lot of people tend to think of the progressive era as just Teddy Roosevelt and maybe Woodrow Wilson, but the state leaders had as much influence as the presidents. The state progressives were successful in two areas especially, working conditions and political reforms. Many states passed laws in working conditions requiring workers' comp, requiring safer working conditions, and prohibiting child labor. As I talked about in first and second period, the workers' comp was a huge change, going from you could be injured on the job in a coal mine or in a factory and lose a hand or something and not be able to work, so you get fired and be injured and out, maybe need medical care and out of a job. And now businesses had to pay into an insurance pool that would then pay out of that fund to workers who got injured, run by the government. That is a major transformation. I'll talk about the political stuff a little bit later. Robert La Follette, of course, from Wisconsin, you read about him. He was governor, he was senator, he was candidate for president, who once received as much as 17% of the vote. He'd been a Republican, but he was so offended by an attempt by other Republicans in the legislature to bribe him that he quit the party and eventually joined the Progressive Party. And worked very hard at political reform. And I'll just mention here, it's a good time to mention it, progressives were a political party, but that's really not the guts of their energy. At this time, there were Republican progressives and there were Democratic progressives. The two parties weren't aligned like they are nowadays. You had conservative parts of both and progressive parts of both. There's a quote, and that takes us back to the beginning of the unit when we talked about all the social and economic and political problems, and I said you can reduce it down to one major problem, and this quote kind of matches that. For sixth period, be sure you understand that. Just two examples of what he accomplished. First, he was one of those guys pushing for workers' comp and got it in Wisconsin. And second, the direct primary, the idea that like in New Hampshire tonight, the voters are directly choosing who they want to be their nominee for their party, as opposed to having the powerful political guys in the back rooms deciding it. There were a lot of different pushes to improve working conditions, but the single event that probably had the most impact was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. There were a lot of garment factory fires around the country. New York City probably had multiple fires every month, but and people would die from them. But this one was kind of a different level because 146 young mostly immigrant workers die, most of them young women, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrants. And the nature of the tragedy kind of shocked the nation and led to reform. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory made actually something called shirtwaists, which was an old-fashioned name for ladies' blouses. That's all that meant. And we talked in January about ready-to-wear clothing, and this is of that era. The factory was in a building that still exists. It's now owned by NYU. It's just an office building near Washington Square Park down in Greenwich Village in New York City. And the Triangle Factory was on the 9th and 10th floors. Somehow the fabric caught fire. The doors were locked. The elevator stopped working and the fire escape that they were supposed to be able to climb out onto and down buckled under the crowd and fell off, and all of those workers were killed. A few workers made it out over the roof and jumped over to another building, but then the fire consumed everything, and they couldn't get out that way anymore. So a lot of the young women ended up climbing out onto the ledge by the window and leaping to escape the flames, and then hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. It was really shocking. It was right around the time when people were getting out of work, so a crowd had gathered for the fire, and so hundreds of people witnessed this. The owners were Isaac Harris and Max Blanc, and they got indicted and then prosecuted for the unsafe working conditions and for causing the deaths. In the end, the verdict was they were acquitted. They were not guilty because it couldn't be proven that they knew that the doors were locked, and actually the laws were so lax that they hadn't really broken any laws, despite the clear lack of safety in the Triangle factory. The fire is significant because, especially after the innocent verdict, or not guilty verdict, the people of New York City and the state were outraged, and that led to reform. That man, Al Smith, was a Tammany Hall politician who actually was not working in city politics but in state politics. He was a state senator in Albany for Manhattan, and he and the Tammany boss realized something had to be done, and Al Smith and others formed a factory investigating commission, which is kind of a typical thing to do after a big tragedy. Doesn't mean anything's going to get done, but this commission actually accomplished stuff. They went all around the state: Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, Oneonta, down to obviously to New York City, and investigated factory after factory for safety and danger. And there's one story where they at one factory, the owner was trying to hide all the children working there on the elevator, and he parked it between floors, and Smith and the other commission members managed to spot them and find them. And then Smith and the others came back and wrote a bunch of the state reform laws that you've read about or we talked about briefly in class, requiring sprinkler systems or better fire escapes or actual checking up by the government, investigation and inspection to make sure things actually were safe. And bit by bit, things began to get a little bit better state by state. And that's why I said to at least some of you that New York was one of the leading states in worker labor reform. The other state reforms were primarily political, and there were a lot of them. Initiative, referendum, and recall were three things that are kind of similar and designed to give voters power again. So, you know, in the Jacksonian era, in the era of the common man, the regular, at least white male, got the chance to vote, and then he was to send people off to Congress or to the legislature to pass laws that he wanted. And by the late 1800s, it felt like the legislatures were just corrupt and were doing what the big businesses wanted and weren't listening. So La Follette and others wanted to give the power back to the people. So like you read, the initiative was a thing where voters could think up a law they wanted, get petitions signed, and if they got enough signatures, it could go on the ballot. And instead of voting on candidates, in addition, the voters would actually vote to yes to have this law or no to have this law. That's called the initiative. It's the most important of these three. New York never adopted it because politically it never really reformed. It had too much corruption. But Wisconsin and California and other states did. And in fact, California still uses it quite extensively. That's a big part of how they make their laws. Referendum's kind of the opposite. If the legislature passed a law that the people didn't like, you could petition and get a referendum on the ballot and decide to remove a law. And recall is like that it's the opposite of an election. You could actually vote to remove a politician before their term was up if you were especially unhappy with the job they were doing. City government, you read about the commission and city manager plans that tried to reduce the influence of the political machines. And then these are not political or state reforms. These are the 4 state reforms, and La Follette's direct primary would fit in here as well, where the voters directly nominated their candidate. These are 2 important political reforms, but they're federal. The 17th Amendment is a big change to our Constitution. Now senators are directly elected by the people, no more through the legislatures of the states. And the 19th Amendment, women are getting the right to vote. And in the reading I asked you which was most important, and it would definitely, without question, it would be the 19th Amendment. Giving half the population the right to vote is probably dwarfs all the other things. You could choose what you want for the other one. And of course the change in the balloting and the way people voted from a colored ballot to a secret ballot, like you read about. Didn't write that on here either, but that's a change as well. I'm going to move to the national part of the lecture. We're at 11 minutes, Ben. Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Some of these slides about Teddy, you don't have to write anything down. It's just kind of FYI, and that's going to make the lecture a little bit longer, but you can just kind of sit back and enjoy the story. How good a president. He's on Mount Rushmore. He's obviously highly rated. Probably in the top 5. There are things to like about him and things that I personally dislike. What was he famous for? He's loud and macho personality and the rugged way he lived his life. What I'm going to focus on here is progressive policies, but also he is one of those presidents who changes the presidency, who makes it more powerful. And he's probably the 4th in the line, so if you can guess who the first 3 were and write those down on your notes, that would be great. And the next unit we'll talk about is foreign policy. Again, a little more biographical background. He was born with a lot of health problems. He had asthma, poor vision, got sick a lot, and doctors didn't think he was going to live very long. And Teddy went the opposite way. He decided, rather than avoiding the outdoors like the doctors recommended and living life in a bubble, he was going to live a rugged outdoor life and build himself up. So he was always into very, much like people of today, into a very fit lifestyle. Did calisthenics, was a big boxer, was a horseback rider and rancher, big hunter, went on expeditions. Really a very adventurous man. There he is, riding a horse out on his ranch in the West. He's full of energy, loud, he's very macho, arrogant, which that's the piece I don't like about him. And then, of course, there's the story of Teddy's bear. He'd been bear hunting, couldn't get a bear. His friends tried to help him out, caught a bear, tied it up for him to shoot. He refused. There was a reporter who was along chronicling his exploits, and kind of like Donald Trump, he was, even when he was not doing political stuff, he was interesting. And he wrote about the hunting trip and drew this cartoon of Teddy refusing to shoot the bear. The cartoon became famous, and pretty soon shop owners were buying and then reselling little stuffed bears that they called Teddy's Bear, and those became what we know as teddy bears. Before he's president, he is a local progressive leader. He's the police commissioner when Reese is doing his reporting and writing in New York City, and he goes on those midnight inspections I talked about, helped clean up the New York City slums. And he's a progressive governor. By the way, Al Smith, the guy who did the Factory Investigating Commission, eventually became governor about 18, 20 years after Teddy, and I would say he's probably New York's greatest governor. by a lot, but that's my own opinion. Now we get back to the stuff that is important. So Teddy did probably 4 things that made him important as a progressive president. He did a lot of trust busting. He pushed conservation to be something that the government was really going to take a major hand in. And then he had kind of this other category of helping workers and regulating things like meat and food and drugs. And then his speeches are an important part of him as a progressive. So we'll take each one in turn. Trust busting. You had a reading question about Northern Securities. That was a railroad company. It was a trust that controlled the railroads from like Minnesota to Washington. Teddy sued it as violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed in 1890. So this is 14 years later. And he was successful. The courts broke it up. And that is significant because that's the first time the government had ever broken a trust up. So that begins the trust-busting era. That's why Northern Securities is important. As you read about, Teddy thought that the modern world was better than the old world. And part of the modern world was big businesses. And big businesses could be good. A big railroad that had the resources to ship people and things all across the country, a big steel factory. So he thought that big could be good, or either, and thought the government should decide whether trust was helping the people or not. And this is a cartoon of when he takes over the presidency. He's first actually not elected. He assumes it. He's vice president, and William McKinley gets assassinated. And everybody thinks that these big, there's J.P. Morgan and some others, that these big industrialists are going to dominate him, but after winning the Northern Securities case, he becomes the big man on campus. And you can see he's got Teddy's bear there. This is Teddy changing the role of government. Before, it was kind of laissez-faire about trusts and monopolies, and now it's going to attack. So his shift is that they're going to ensure fair competition and regulate, not dissolve, big business. I don't know if you got those words in there. Ensure fair competition, regulate, not dissolve. Also, this strengthened the government. So this is one of the examples of him strengthening the presidency and the executive branch. Conservation. Under Teddy, the government began to protect the wilderness and to manage its use. And there is Teddy right here in California at one of the big sequoia redwood trees, which are just massive, ancient structures. He created the U.S. Forestry Service. He preserved land, and he didn't start the national park system, but he has a big hand in kind of giving it a kick, getting it going. He's a big piece of that. This is him at Yosemite. He was very entertaining and liked the attention, and the press loved him. So these photo ops would appear in the newspapers, and it would get people's attention to kind of care about lands that they hadn't really thought of as theirs. And he kind of promoted the idea that the wilderness and the national parks are the people's property, and the government should control them for the benefit of the people. And that's a very progressive idea. Of course, he also passed consumer legislation. Well, Congress passed it, but with his push, and you read about that, the Meat Inspection Act and Food and Drug Act that came out of the reaction to the jungle. And then he did a lot of pro-union, pro-worker stuff. He settled the coal industry strike in 1902, and that is significant because that's the first time that the government has really, in a major strike, come down as a fair mediator between the industry and the workers. He didn't so much help the workers as he made sure that they got a fair negotiation with the mine owners. And that's a huge shift, as you know, from the labor troubles of the late 1800s. And he did pass something called the Employer Liability Act, which is not a major thing, but just the idea that employers were responsible for injuries on the job kind of thing and could be held liable or sued. It's a beginning of workers having some rights on the job. Teddy called the presidency a bully pulpit, and what he meant by that phrase, which is very old-fashioned, is that people listen to you when you're the president, and so you can speak about things that matter and get their attention. And he is one of the first to really use the presidency effectively that way. Lincoln, of course, had great speeches, and other people as well, but those speeches could only be heard live. His impact was mostly live, but Edison had started inventing recording devices, and so it was possible to hear his speeches to a certain extent, even if it wasn't live, but I've kind of gotten off track. That's not really the main point of this. The main point is he used his excellent speaking ability to try to convince the nation of what should be done, and he's probably more effective at that than any president previously. We'll do more with Teddy in the next unit. I'm going to go quickly through Taft. He was Teddy's vice president and then became president after him when Teddy was done. Not as successful as Teddy. They were originally very close, but Teddy became disappointed with him, and they became big political enemies. That's the two of them in a knife fight while Uncle Sam, the country, watches. Taft was successful. He busted more trusts than Teddy. He added more lands to the national forest than Teddy, but he didn't have Teddy's charisma, and he didn't have the kind of popularity that Teddy had. Teddy had been president until 1908. Taft was president in 08 to 1912, and then the 1912 election, Teddy wants to run again, but Taft does too, and they're both Republicans. So eventually Taft gets nominated, and Teddy starts a new political party, the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party, and eventually La Follette joined that as well. It was called the Bull Moose Party as a nickname because Teddy said, "I'm as fit as a bull moose and ready to run," even though he was a little bit older than he had been before. A bull moose being a big, powerful man moose. Teddy's platform was New Nationalism, and sit down and pay attention to this one. Teddy believed in the modern world. He said the big cities and the big factories are here to stay. We're not going to get rid of them, and we should just accept them. And so bigness is here to stay. But government should be big and active to match that. Otherwise, it's going to be an unequal world, and it's going to have all the problems of too much economic power and too much political power controlled by a few people. He said the match for that is not to try and turn back the clock, but to accept it and move on. And in the long run, we've adopted what Teddy said, but it took a while. He saw two roles for government. One, like with the trusts, they should control businesses. And two, he is an early advocate for something we call the safety net, that the government should take the responsibility for protecting those who kind of fall through the cracks of society. A minimum wage, workers' comp, Social Security for old people. He was arguing for all those things and that the federal government should pass them. He's not going to win the election, so this stuff isn't going to get passed. But he's going to lay the foundation, much the way the populists laid the foundation for the progressives. These issues are going to be taken up 20 years later during FDR's presidency, the Great Depression, with the New Deal. And these things are going to get passed at the federal level. So you should be able to make that connection between the progressives and the New Deal. Wilson, the third candidate, wanted something different. He disliked the modern world and the trends toward bigness. He wanted to use the government. He's still a progressive, but he wanted to take the country back. The government is going to be like an umpire who ensures that competition is free and fair. But he definitely didn't like the social safety net idea. He didn't think that the government should get that involved in people's lives. Now what's funny is Teddy is a Republican, going to run as a progressive. Wilson is a Democrat. The two parties have kind of switched roles in that way in the 100 years since. In the 1912 election, you've got Wilson here on the left, you've got Taft on the right, and coming in between is Teddy Roosevelt, Democrat, progressive, Republican. Together, Taft and TR get about 50% of the vote. And note that TR actually got more than Taft. But Wilson, in a split vote, gets 42%, and that's the popular vote. In the electoral vote, he does much better. And there's a fourth candidate I don't show here, Eugene Debs, running on the socialist ticket, far to the left of any of these guys, gets over 1 million votes. I think it's about something like 4 or 6% of the total vote. Pretty amazing. And we were at 26 minutes, but we're going to finish up with Woodrow Wilson. How good a president is he? I'm going to give you a different answer now than I would have about 10 years ago. I've never been a huge Wilson fan, but his reputation has taken a knock lately. He's often considered, one of the top 6 or 8 or so, but lately he was pretty racist, and that's been getting more attention in the last 2 or 3 years. So here we go. Income Tax, Federal Reserve Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, Federal Trade Commission, and why is each of these progressive? So Wilson gets those 4 main things done at the national level. He gets the income tax passed, the 16th Amendment. That's big. Income taxes weren't allowed at the federal level until Wilson's presidency, and that you have to actually amend the Constitution to allow them. And what he gets passed is a graduated income tax, meaning the more you make, the higher your tax rate. So if you make, $10,000, your tax rate might be 6%. But then if you make $30,000, anything above that initial $10,000 is going to get taxed at a higher rate. And that is supposed to attack one problem that hadn't really been addressed prior to this, which was inequality. So that is a big step towards reducing the inequality, because the rich are going to get taxed at a higher rate than, I'm trying to write inequality here so you get that, than the middle class or the poor. The Federal Reserve Act you read about sets up a national banking system. Some people said this didn't seem like a very progressive thing. But if one of the problems of the industrial era is the up and down nature of the economy and the boom and bust, the Federal Reserve is supposed to try to balance it out a little bit, because they are controlling, to a certain extent, the money supply. They issue, so if you take out a dollar bill, if you have any on you, they issue the Federal Reserve notes. Those are what our dollar bills are called. So we don't really have a national currency. We do, but the one that we use now doesn't start until Wilson's presidency. And so this is a progressive law and a progressive change, because it is the government regulating banking and the financial sector, the money supply, in order to kind of help the people and prevent the booms and busts of the economy from hurting people. So that makes it progressive. The Clayton Antitrust Act is a stronger version of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it gives the federal government more power to go after trusts and monopolies. So that's just it's like the Hepburn Act strengthened the ICC. And then fourth, the Federal Trade Commission was a new federal agency that could investigate the things that businesses were doing, the way they were advertising or selling their products, and order them to stop if they were making claims that weren't true, or if they were selling shoddy products. So that is a pretty big change in terms of regulating business and fixing things like selling, taking advantage of the consumers. So that's I would say, Wilson's 4 big accomplishments. More on Wilson in the next unit when we study World War I, and we are going to stop there.